Hey, hello everybody. This is Gaming as Women, invading Indie Plus with our opinions on gender and feminism and games and such. And tonight we're going to be talking about gender-inclusive narratives in tabletop role-playing games. So talking about different examples of design, arts, and mechanics in different role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games in particular, that reinforce gender-inclusive narratives and what that looks like. I'm Kira Magrann. I am a blogger at Gaming as Women. I also write some games. I've written some games, and I talk about games a lot. I organize game events like Games on Demand. You can find me on G+ at Kira Magrann. And I'm here with two of my other fellow Gaming as Women bloggers, Rowan, Cota, and Arlene Medler, and they're going to join me in this discussion tonight. If you two could introduce yourselves. Rowan, do you want to go first?
Sure thing. Hi, I'm Rowan. I obviously blog at Gaming as Women, which is why I'm on this panel tonight. In addition, I also do some social justice and nerdy blogging at rowancota.com, and I guess as of the beginning of April, I also now give panels on things like communication skills and how they will help your gaming table. I'm pretty excited by the concept of gender-inclusive narratives, in part because growing up in gaming, I've never really seen the other side. My table has always kludged together rules for being gender-inclusive when they didn't exist in games, or contributed our own narratives and art. So it's a topic that I'm pretty passionate about. I will toss it to Arlene.
Who has to find her mic? Arlene Medler. I have been gaming for a while. I am also obviously occasional contributor to Gaming as Women, and I could say more, but I will talk forever, and I should give other people a chance to talk too. Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks, both of you. And I guess I'm going to just give a brief intro on what we're going to be talking about in this brief half-hour segment. We're going to talk about mostly, kind of what I said before. There's a bunch of different ways that games can be inclusive towards different genders. You can look at the art and the visuals of the game. You can look at the in-game fiction and canon. I'm reading off of my list here. You can look at the mechanics of the game and also the themes. So, there's kind of different layers and like a wide spectrum of engaging with games on an inclusive level. And some of those like kind of dial in and become a little more nuancey, and some of them are more broadly focused and more representative. And we're going to kind of talk about those differences with some concrete examples from different games. But mostly, I just kind of want to talk a second about representation and how creating gender-inclusive mechanics isn't just about representation of gender. So you can't just kind of leave room for gender in your games. You have to intentionally create mechanics that talk about that gendered experience. So you can show artwork or different characters in your narrative that represent those different genders on the broad gender spectrum that we have, but that's not the same as telling a story about that gender, which is essentially what we're doing with role-playing games. We're telling stories about genders and stories in general, right, that also include genders, lots of different genders. So you want to think about that narrative and what kind of narratives you're creating within that game object that you're designing. When we're talking about game design and what we're going to talk about as tabletop games in this particular session in particular is that games are objects. So we're not going to talk about game culture, and we're not going to talk about table culture in particular. We're going to talk about the game as an object itself, look at the text of the game book, the narrative of the game book, the visual design and design in general of those game mechanics of the game book, or PDF, or however you're interacting with that game. So those are the things we're talking about tonight. And we're also going to talk about briefly, before we get into anything else, how form follows function, right? So form following function is a basic design philosophy where what you're designing has to kind of follow the function that it's serving. So if you're designing a teapot, for example, you have to not only make it look like a teapot, but you have to make it function like a teapot. So water actually has to flow through the teapot in order to pour tea. It can't just look like a pretty teapot. So like looking like the teapot in this metaphor is the representation, and the function of pouring tea is the mechanics of the game. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about a little and diving a little bit more into. That's my teapot metaphor. And before I talk for much longer, I'm going to kind of jump to Rowan and Arlene and get a few examples that they've pulled together. And I have a few examples myself that we can talk about tonight. But Rowan, I know that you have some good examples that you wanted to address. I think Dream Askew was on your list.
Yes, it was. And actually, when you pitched the idea of doing this conversation, Dream Askew was the first thing that came to mind for me. For people who aren't familiar with it, let's call it an evolution of Powered by the Apocalypse. It takes the kind of the basic ideas of Powered by the Apocalypse, the playbooks, the communal narrative building, that sort of thing, but it removes the role of MC and distributes it around the table. So I don't want to call it a straight Powered by the Apocalypse game, just to keep from confusing that too much, you know. But one of the things I love about Dream Askew is that gender is built into it from the very core. So if you're familiar with the Powered by the Apocalypse playbook, you know how you have your options where you select your name and your look and so on and so on. And in Dream Askew, one of the things you actually select is your gender presentation. And I want to be specific that I have noticed in the playbook it is gender presentation, not necessarily gender identity. So for instance, one of the things you can choose is ambiguous, which means maybe people can't figure it out. Maybe you don't know what it is, but maybe it's just you know and are not sharing that with anyone. And one of the things I love about Dream Askew is that in addition to baking that right into the core of the game, is that it opens the door for a spectrum of gender presentations, gender identities. They're your typical, you know, man, woman, femme, butch kind of things. But one of the genius additions, in my opinion, is that Avery added gargoyle as an option. And there's no explanation. So if you sit down at the table and you pick gargoyle, you decide for yourself what that means and how that's displayed. And then you're describing it as you describe your character when they go around to describe characters. But by doing that, Avery allowed for the possibility of inclusion of the gender spectrum, you know, from male to female to genderqueer to various non-binaries, but also the game itself opens the door for you to bring your experiences with gender instead of saying you have to be limited by these 5 things that are on the piece of paper. And I think that in terms of making people able to be comfortable, that mechanic support is really key. It's hard to feel comfortable trying to bring something new until the mechanics open the door for that. And so I really like how Avery has done that right at the heart, building on the fact that Powered by the Apocalypse has always been at its core sort of this essentially gender-inclusive space. And my favorite example of that is to go all the way back to the great-granddaddy of Apocalypse games, Apocalypse World, where it specifically says that the battle babe can be a dude. Which is not, like, it's based on movie tropes, and you don't necessarily see a guy be the battle babe in movies. So the fact that it textually says the battle babe can be a man is just kind of this eye-opening option, in my opinion. And I'm going to stop babbling on now about Apocalypse things.
No, that was great. I actually have Apocalypse World in front of me. Apocalypse World. And in the Skinner example, which you probably can't read, but you can see that it says look. And under look, it says man, woman, ambiguous, transgressing, or androgyne. And that was kind of like, that's an example of one of the characters of Skinner, right? There's different options, I believe, for all the different characters. Like you can be also transgressing, or different things. And it's a little bit more binary than a lot of the things that came after it, right? Like what you're describing in Dream Askew is a little less binary. Like there's a little more gender exploration. But this kind of opened the door for being like, hey, I could describe my character's look. My character's gender presentation is something other than a man or a woman. And that's a big deal. Like that speaks to a lot of people who identify outside of the gender binary, who are genderqueer, or who maybe never even thought about identifying their character outside of a man or a woman binary, right? So Apocalypse World, yay! is the theme of that. Monster Hearts does it too. Monster Hearts is Avery McDonald's other game, and it also gets into explicit non-binary genders on the play sheet. So and in there, the themes in Monster Hearts itself are playing like queer teenagers. So you're kind of exploring that identity. So part of the essential theme of that game, the theme of playing those characters, is getting into an exploration of gender, which if you're talking about inclusion, you're intentionally delving into those themes. Excellent. So that's my grandson. I have a few more Apocalypse World examples, but I'll let Arlene speak. I know Arlene has some really good examples too.
I'm the old school gamer, I guess. One of my examples is from 1999, which is a game called Ironclaw that is anthropomorphic, so you're playing various animals that are not humans. And my favorite example is the flaw lustful, which I actually read out to Kira and Rowan earlier, which deliberately does not use any pronoun other than you. You feel this way, you may embarrass yourself, even it says as would-be paramours. There is no gender language in the flaw at all, which opens up the doors to whatever the player wants it to be. Does the player male, female, attracted, neither really, but attracted to some beyond this on the scale? The other game I had, which is not quite that old, is Blue Rose, which is not the first game, but it was very much we are deliberately making an inclusive game. We are stating it up front. There is inclusion. You have males, you have females, you have people who are on a spectrum. So, and I know that Rowan had something that she wanted to tie into this, so I'll let her speak up again.
Well, Arlene, if you had more to say, you could keep going. I was loving listening to that. What I wanted to say is actually one of the things that reminded me of is really my experience with White Wolf games, and how White Wolf games were kind of the first time that I ever felt like it was okay to decide that my character was a girl. You play a girl vampire and no one cares. It doesn't make your powers any different. It doesn't make you any less awesome. But also, specifically, I wanted to talk about Werewolf, which had a tribe of werewolves that were all women. And that sounds gender exclusive, like, okay, if you can't play a guy Black Fury, except that everything else in the game was open, and so people would automatically default to male, and so it was mechanically thrusting in your face that there were other choices. And it was doing that by sort of carving out this tiny little separate space and saying, no, in this space we're going to pick something that isn't the dominant option, which in the 90s, when that happened, was unheard of in gaming. That was not a thing that you specifically said. It might be okay to play a girl in the game, but we didn't write that into the text. That wasn't a thing. So it was a huge door opener, mechanically and narratively, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, sometimes in order to be inclusive, you have to be exclusive, right? Like when we're talking about affinity groups, we look at minority groups that kind of gather who are all women or all queer or all black or however you identify in order to kind of find commonalities among you and find those strengths and gather some kind of power, a social power from that, right? A community from that. And so it's important, even though it feels regressive to say the Black Furies are all female, men aren't allowed here. And very like, I don't know,
to me.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, it depends, again, the context of the time period, the context of the people playing when it was written. And additionally, I think it's important for affinity groups to gather and find those strengths with each other. There's power in women gathering together and having women-only spaces or genderqueer spaces or non-binary spaces or queer spaces. So like looking at those for what they are is really important. I also just want to point out really quick, speaking of old school games, I had someone comment, and I didn't know this about, I don't play much D&D. I'm out. I play mostly Werewolf. But the 1981 Moldvay basic D&D rules did have some gender diversity to them in comparison to a lot of D&D that followed that version. It had the his or her pronoun referring to players and characters in the text the same way that White Wolf did. That was kind of progressive. For the time. The examples of play used male and female characters, and the example character, who was Morgan Ironwolf, was a lady fighter. So that's really cool. The canonical fictional character was a lady. And the illustrations of the PCs in the book were both men and women. So, as far as representation and everything goes, there were images of men and women pretty equally, which was different and changed over time, unfortunately. Like we look at a lot of stuff from the 80s and it was sometimes more progressive than it is now, which is a super shame. But that was the thing that happened in the Moldfade version of D&D, I hear. But I'm not an expert.
I've been gaming, as I said, a while, and I remember the first time the characters and the examples, the players and the examples were women, because I had played a lot of games and that very rarely happened when I first started playing. In fact, I don't remember which game it was, but it was, I'm fairly certain, in the 90s that they went, oh wait, they're recognizing that I play games too, which, like I said, since I've been playing since like 1980 something. I was like, wow, and then, wait, they're using actual, the use of pronouns came before the use of women in play examples, so that was in some ways even more stunning than having the pronoun change of sometimes using she and her as opposed to always using he and him, because that's one thing that's referring to NPCs, that's referring to example PCs, but actual saying the players are women was huge. And then with the one that had a woman as the GM, it was like, wow, because I've been running games since the late 80s, and it was recognizing that there were people out there like me. It was recognized in the book itself, which again, I'm trying to remember which book, I don't remember which game it was, and I bet whatever copy I have is somewhere in storage. I should have looked up Shadowrun, which was the first game I ran, to see just how inclusive was it for the day. It did have women characters, although the main woman character on the artwork was dressed scantily. She was wearing shorts, for example. I'm like, shorts? Really? I mean, I know it's jeans versus shorts doesn't make a lot of sense when there's bullets flying, but still.
Right, that's a huge issue, right? Like even when women are represented in art, it's not necessarily the best representation. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that's super interesting to kind of look over time how gender inclusion has changed and kind of how far we have come for sure. And it's really awesome to see all of the new progressive ideas that are kind of pushing us into, you know, contemporary times as far as like how gender could be represented in stories and in media. And I think, but there's a few more old school games we were thinking of. Old school games we were thinking of. Rowan, you were thinking of Tribe 8, right?
Yeah, it feels so weird to call Tribe 8 old school. Like, I remember when they got that at my game store, and it was this huge deal. Like, I walked in there, and I was like, oh my god, this game has a cosmology that's entirely built around women, and no one in the game thinks that's weird. Like, textually, the entire cosmology is built around the Fatimas, and all of them except one are women. But they're women that have dynamic aspects. So yes, some of them have stereotypical women's roles, quote unquote. Like you have Eva the mother or Baba Yaga the crone. But then you also have Joan the warrior, or the one that actually really got me, which was Terasheba the wise. Because wisdom in fantasy gaming is not a trait you normally see assigned to women in the narrative. Women are frequently the ones that will leave the party behind and rush into the trap-filled room, for example, in the narrative. Or you get characters like, oh, what is her name from Forgotten Realms? The Frying Pan. I can't think of her name, but you know, she runs around beating people up with this frying pan because she's hot-tempered and quick to anger. So seeing that women could fill these different archetypes and be whole people outside of being women was another really interesting thing. And I think in some ways we've really actually fallen down on that in modern gaming. I think there's a lot of hesitance to, I don't know, to masculinify women. We're afraid that we're going to take their womanhood away if we give them these masculine attributes. And so that's a thing I'd like to see more, is to bring these whole people in who are women but are also other things that are not diminished by being women.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's hard to draw the line between women and tomboy, essentially. Like, actually, I've been watching a whole lot of horror movies, and like one of the reasons a final girl usually survives is because she's like partially masculine. She has masculine traits, so that's what saves her, is that she's tough or she's pure or whatever. She didn't have sex, so she's not like the rest of those ladies. So yeah, that's kind of a shame. I had another old school example that I mined from my OSR thread about inclusive OSR games, which I don't know too much about. I haven't played too many. But there's an OSR game based in Africa that's called Spears of the Dawn, and it explicitly states that although societies are generally stuck in their traditions, including gender roles and sexuality, that those rules don't apply to the PCs. So that's super interesting, you know, like the person who pointed this to me, KCG, he says that no one bats an eye at a woman wearing armor and carrying weapons. She's a spear. And there's also backgrounds where men and women live lives as the other sex and gender and have important roles in their society. So that's super interesting. In a way, like Dogs in the Vineyard also does this. Like when you're like, I'm a PC and I live outside of this very sexist, gendered society. How do I deal with that? Because basically I'm an enforcer and I can tell other people what to do. And that kind of brings into question like how you are moderating a gendered society, which is super weird because you're acting outside of it. Rowan, you wanted to say something about Dogs in the Vineyard too, right?
Yeah. So my husband really loves the Gunslinger books by Stephen King, and so we tried to hack Dogs in the Vineyard to play a Gunslinger game. Except the problem is that the concept of my character was that she was a girl gunslinger, and that was a big deal, because in gunslinger society, you can't be a woman and have a gun. And we couldn't make Dogs in the Vineyard work, because there was no way to hack it, because it explicitly says that if you're a dog, not a man or a woman. That you are just an agent of God. That's your job. And so we had these like 4 really frustrating sessions where we banged our heads up against it, because mechanically there was no way to make the narrative gender exclusive, which I thought was really interesting, that when you tried to become exclusionary, the game actually broke.
Yeah, that's super weird. I think both of those are strange examples on how to, like, I don't know, that's like a greater metaphor for the gender problem in society, right? The game breaks. But yeah, I mean, that's an interesting example of how you can kind of dial into gender, aside from kind of making it super inclusive into the mechanics itself. Just kind of like standing outside of those mechanics. Yeah, I also just I have a few more examples. I feel like Arlene, though, before I go off on a tangent, were there any more examples that you had on your list that you wanted to talk about?
The game Witch Hunter is alternate history, mid-17th century. In Witch Hunter, 4 out of 5 men died in the Black Plague, which, of course, as we know from other circumstances, if there's no male to fill the role, women will step up, because the farm has to get the seeds have to be planted, the plow has to be fixed. People are going to do this. Well, it's been some time. The sexes are equalized, but you still have the echo that women are a lot more accepted in this alternate history than they were in our actual history, because when you have an entire generation of women filling these roles, they're not going to step out of them. And as part of the narrative is one of the things you do for your character is you do your career. One of the career options is midwife. So your that has in-game benefits, and you will therefore have certain social benefits among women because you're a midwife. You should have social benefits among women. They should go, oh, I will tell you things that I would not tell anybody else, and definitely would never tell someone who wasn't trained in this. Which, again, it's ooh, what a concept! It's also a game that has very good non-combat, very helpful character roles, which I have to admit I like. So I just suddenly thought of that. How could I forget Witch Hunter with the midwife?
Yeah, no, I mean, having a midwife option in a game is awesome. That's fucking amazing. That reminds me of Burning Wheel. In Burning Wheel, you can, if your character has been pregnant, in your character's history, you get a +1 to your steel, because you've been through pregnancy. So it makes you more badass, right? I mean, having a game even consider things like midwifery or pregnancy, part of a woman's experience, some women's experience. Big deal. And, as far as like alternate histories, when you talk about what women have been through in the past in World War II, I just played Night Witches for a very long time. I love that game. And there's a really cool thing that Night Witches does with gender. I mean, you're already all playing women pilots in World War II. Awesome. Night Witches. In Night Witches, there's this really cool move. So moves are part of the essential game mechanics, right? Where you can act up to get your way. But you can act up like a hooligan, you can act up like a lady, or you can act up like a natural-born Soviet airwoman. Those are your 3 options, right? And so it's actually calling into question, like, well, as a woman, you have nuanced responses to like how you can respond to things and act up. And how you're deciding to act up will maybe color how you're role-playing, what your character is like, your character choices. And adding nuance to a woman's character super important to any kind of gendered character, because it's basically saying you're not just a woman, you're a complex human being like everybody else. And these are some of the gender traps that you fall into, some of the issues that you might encounter. So I love that move in Night Witches. Everybody always goes to that move, like as a go-to, like, I'm acting up. What am I going to do against the authority? So that's super cool. Sagas of the Icelanders. These are all Apocalypse World hacks. I'm sorry, I'm pulling from my sheets that are behind me. If you've never played Sagas of the Icelanders, this is an excellent gendered game. You can have female moves or male moves in an Apocalypse World game. Basically, your female moves, you can entice a man, you can lie with a man to conceive a child, you can raise your voice and talk sense, or you can goad a man to action. Those are things you can only do as a woman in that game. As a man, you can only do consider an uneasy situation, accept a physical challenge, throw an insult at another man, or when your honor is in question, you can respond to that. But if you want to do anything outside those gender roles, either as a man or a woman, you can't do it. You have to ask a woman or a man to do it, and that's frustrating. Like, that is instantly frustrating to players of that game, because they're like, why can't I do this thing? Why do I have gender role restrictions? So it points out gender role restrictions, right, that exist in society, kind of through like a historical fiction lens, which is super excellent. So I love that about that game. Trying to think of what else. Kagematsu. This is my last rant. Purposefully subverts who is running the game and who is playing the game out of character, to highlight the gender roles in the fiction and at the table simultaneously. So basically, all of the players are female characters. They're supposed to be men playing female characters. The person running the game is supposed to be a woman playing a man in charge. So it's talking about the power that the GM has in a game. And like, when you look at GM power in lots of tabletop role-playing games, it's often, a lot of role-playing games are run by men. And that is a gendered dynamic. And when you take the GM out of the picture, if you make a GM-less game, it kind of upsets that gender balance. So that's talking about, again, mechanics that are inclusive and that talk about gender.
Apocalypse World. So yeah. I had thought, but if you look at Apocalypse World, Apocalypse World does a really interesting thing too, because the MC is supposedly running the game, but their entire job is to be receptive to what the players are throwing out to them, which is normally a woman's role. A woman is supposed to be receptive and then sort of take that stuff and synthesize it and carry forward, and that becomes the MC's responsibility in Apocalypse World, which I had never considered it until right this second, but it totally queers the play dynamic in this beautiful way. So I had to throw that out there.
No, that's amazing. Thanks for saying that. That's really true. The MC in Apocalypse World is supposed to ask a lot of questions. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about Fate, which I just thought about, is that when people are creating their aspects, that's telling the GM, this is what I want to see in the game. I wouldn't make this aspect if I didn't want to play it. So it's up to the GM to go, you want what? Okay, let's see how we can work that into the game. So again, it's another form of very receptive that the player is making demands on what the game's going to be like. Now, reasonably, they'll negotiate. I'm sorry, you cannot play a cyborg in my 10th century social game. But let's see what we can work with, and maybe some sort of golem, artificial parts or something. But still, the player is making statements on what they want.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, those are great examples. Like, you can deconstruct a lot of this stuff on the mechanical level and talk about like where agency is, right? Because when you're talking about gender mechanics, a lot of times it's about giving genders a voice at the table who might not necessarily have a voice automatically, and intentionally making moves towards doing that. So yeah, all of those mechanics are great examples. I think that we're out of time, technically. Our half hour is up. I think we're going to leave it at that. So thank you so much, Rowan and Arlene. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody who has tuned in and watched. Stay tuned. We're going to be airing these every month. Gaming is Women on Indie Plus. We'll be having more gender discussions. If you have any questions, feel free to hit us up on G Plus after the panel. At any time, we're happy to enter into some discussions. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm sure that Rowan and Arlene do too. So thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.